Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer, and I'm excited to be your guide for this AZ-500 Microsoft Azure Security Technologies. This learning path is going to take a look at securing compute, storage, and database resources, and specifically, this module is going to be on planning and implementing advanced security for compute options. When we take a look at the compute options, there's a variety that fall into areas within Azure where we take a look at things like an IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, that traditional environment where you have virtual machines. And so we're going to take a look at a feature like Azure Bastion to be able to get in and manage that base infrastructure of servers. We're then going to also take a look at the different PaaS offerings, the platform as a service. I've mentioned in another recording a thing called an app service plan. We're going to introduce a feature in this delivery of a thing called an AKS, or Azure Kubernetes Solutions. So we'll take a look at the different PaaS and IaaS offerings and ways to secure them. So jumping in and taking a look at the security for those different compute options, we're going to start with, as we have with all these modules, looking at the MCSB, the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, and the security controls that you can now implement across Windows Defender for Cloud. So really, we're taking a look at the security focus, and I'm going to introduce the technologies that then relates to the MCSB configurations that you can now centrally manage, control, and configure for your enterprise to make sure you've got things configured and deployed in a secure manner. So one of the things we want to take a look at is Azure Bastion. Now, you might have heard of terms in the past of a PA, a privileged access workstation. Maybe you've heard of a thing called a jump box. These were all technologies that people used to gain access to managing some infrastructure. The PA, or privileged access workstation, was an elevated device that you have to have an elevated account. When we took a look at identity protection, maybe you are an administrator, absolutely, but if you're just checking your email, you shouldn't be an administrator at that point in time. So maybe somebody calls up and says, I need you to fix something, Bob. So what you're going to now do is switch off of your regular device. You're going to switch over to the privileged access workstation, which is a lockdown, secure device. Maybe it's got specific controls and specific applications, and everything else is locked down. And then you're going to make that request using the privileged identity management to elevate yourself up for a period of time. Maybe it's an automatic process, maybe it needs an approval to give you that elevated control feature to allow you to log on to the PA, and now you can start to manage services from that privileged access workstation. Another way to do this was a jump box you might have heard of. They become a central location that people would RDP into to then be able to control, hopefully not the end devices, but to use that jump box to then make the leap forward to control the devices like your Exchange servers or SQL servers, a way to do that. What Azure Bastion does is provide that capability for the virtual machines that you might be running inside of Azure itself, and gives it a public endpoint. So whether you're on premises, you can do this through the portal. You can use a RDP piece of software to connect to it, but it's going to then expose the Azure Bastion resource. And for all intents and purposes, it's a virtual machine that we build, so it's a Microsoft configured device that is locked down. It is literally stripped down to the minimum requirements to be able for you to connect to it and communicate with the back-end resources. So it has some public-facing front end. You see that in that graphical component. And so if I were to take a look at the virtual network, that's that light blue box. So we have a subnet specifically for the Azure Bastion environment. Now, it's not on the slide, and maybe I'll draw it in just a second. We've talked about a hub and spoke network and using features called VNet peering. So if I had a hub and spoke, I could actually have two back-end VNets that were maybe the back-end services where my application actually resided. And this is going to be that hub environment. So maybe you have a VPN connection into it, we've talked about. Maybe you have that firewall feature in that hub network. Azure Bastion would be another service that you could put into that hub feature. Now, I would recommend that especially because of the cost and central administration. Because remember, through VNet peering, by default, you're going to have access to all the subnets in the other VNets that are peered with this hub network that you're working with. And so I could use my Azure Bastion device to connect to all those devices if I wanted to. I had one customer that was actually putting Azure Bastion into all of the VNets because that's what they thought they had to do. And it increases the cost 2, 3, 4-fold. For every new Bastion that they put in it increases the cost when in fact they didn't need to do that. So think about centralizing your Azure Bastions into a hub and spoke network, put it as close to the entry to that hub and spoke network as possible in that hub network in a separate subnet in your VNet. So it's going to have this lockdown device. It's managed and built by Microsoft. It's locked down. You're going to make either an SSL or an RDP connection to that device in a secure manner. You're going to then be able to, through a connection that Bastion network has to, or subnet has to all the other subnets, you're going to then be able to RDP to those devices or SSL to them. And because those devices are in other subnets, you're going to be able to have NSG rules that are going to be automatically configured or built around your custom configuration to manage it. So it's a great way to provide endpoint management to those devices through the Azure Bastion environment. Another service that we offer is in the PaaS offering now is AKS, or Azure Kubernetes Services. And I don't want to make this a Kubernetes and container environment, but you have to understand the components. So instead of you having to build all of the infrastructure, the vast majority of this infrastructure is going to be managed by Microsoft. So that top part of the right-hand side of the slide. So all of the AKS, the Kubernetes and the container environments is installed, maintained, and secured by Microsoft. And then we give you the capability to build on top of that. Now, while containers are the thing that you deploy your applications to, you've got to understand the hierarchical piece. And so maybe I'm going to do some whiteboarding for just a second to make some sense of this. And we'll try and highlight where you can put security into your AKS solution. So let's go to a whiteboard session for a second. So for an AKS solution, let's take a look at all the parts that are available for us. So I'm going to start off in the upper left-hand corner, and you've got some code that represents your application that exists in some repository. So I'm going to have, maybe it's a GitHub repository. So you've got a repo, is the technical term that everybody calls it, where your code is. You're going to want to make sure that that repo has security around it. There's a wide variety of both public and private. We even have repos in Azure that you can use to manage who can access it, who can update the information, but the code should be in a secure location. The second part in the upper right-hand corner is where we're going to have our container registry. A container registry is going to be a location where your base containers, the images of what those containers are going to look like, are going to be stored. And again, you want security around your container registry. There's a wide variety. Docker has them. There's publicly available ones. You might have one on premises. And we've got an Azure Container Registry feature inside of Azure as well that provides a central location, high availability. I would recommend, if you're not using it, to take a look at it. But now what you have is, and I'm going to draw them as different colors and sizes and shapes, but you can have different containers. You can have Linux containers. You can have Windows-based containers if they have that specific feature. But basically, a container becomes a base image in which you can deploy your code. That container is going to have different characteristics. It might have features for the amount of memory that it has, the amount of storage it has. So I'm going to just call this 1 core. Maybe you have a bigger version that has 4 cores. Maybe you've got containers that have some tools that have been installed in them and pre-configured. I'm going to draw that maybe as a different color. So I've got a different container that has some tools that are in it. Maybe it's WinZip or something, but you've already pre-configured the container to have something in it. You might have a different container that is going to be available for you. These are just base images. Then you get your container environment, your AKS solution, and at the end of the day, you create what's called a build. And a build takes some code, it takes some image, and merges the two of them together. So you now have, in this case, I'm going to have a green container deployed on my AKS solution with my app in it running. And we're going to take a look at the security of that. Now that container, this green container with an app in it, exists in a thing called a pod. Most people don't talk about this. I'm not going to make it about AKS, but a pod can have one or more containers in it. So in fact, if I needed to, I could potentially have a build process that puts two containers into the same pod. Now that pod gets deployed to a thing called a node, which for all intents and purposes is a virtual machine. Now this is why we get into the security piece. So, this is just preamble. Your pod can have one or more containers. These containers have resources. So let's say that this is a virtual machine that has 24 cores and it's got 128 gigs of RAM. I've just taken, with these two containers, I've taken maybe 4 or 5 cores, I've taken some RAM. So I can only deploy as many pods onto this infrastructure that we have resources for. Once I consume all the resources of this node, I then potentially need more nodes. And so you now have multiple nodes, and these exist in a thing called a pool. All of this is infrastructure that needs to be secured, monitored, and maintained. And that's the background I wanted to take a look at. So let's go back to the slides, if that makes sense to you. We're going to take a look at where we can apply security in this overall solution. So what you're seeing on the slide is very similar to what I've drawn. AKS emits some values so you can check to see what the update versions are and manage that component. But really what you're looking down is at the bottom of the slide where your container VMs, they're being built by Microsoft, but you still configure them. You say, I want a Windows pool running Windows Server 2019 with this. So you can still configure that. You might not be able to reach out to those virtual machines and get the base operating system configuration, but Microsoft emits a lot of this information for you so you can include it in your MCSB monitoring so you know what's happening, although you can't physically connect to those underlying services. So that's, I guess, the big takeaway here is AKS is a great solution. You don't have to buy the servers. You don't have to install the servers. You don't have to configure the servers. You don't have to secure the servers. That is all going to be managed for you. And all of the things that you as a security analyst need to know is how are they running? I need to get this emitted information, and that's going to be available for you as part of the MCSB for your monitoring, configuration, and the deployment of those environments. So when you deploy an AKS service, you can have two types of isolation. So network isolation can go to a logical isolation or a physical isolation. There's pros and cons to both. The logical operation is going to allow you to have your containers deployed to a logical infrastructure while they're separated from the other resources running on that server. They are potentially shared with other applications that are running by other people in your organization or possibly other organizations. But it's an optimum way to run the services. You're going to optimize the hardware that's going to be used. Now, the physical isolation, you and you alone are going to be able to deploy and have your containers run on the infrastructure that is being physically isolated. Now, that is going to make it way more secure, but it comes at potential more cost because if you're not utilizing all the resources of the pools and the nodes, you're going to be potentially paying for resources that are not being used. So pros and cons to both. One is more secure, physical isolation. Logical is cheaper, but what level of security do you need? And maybe it's controlled by government regulations or industry standards. They may dictate what you might have to do, but they can be monitored in either of those secure environments. So taking a look at what we just talked about, so Windows Defender for Cloud has the way to protect the AKS features from environmental hardening that you're working with, vulnerability assessments, all of that stuff, as I've said, gets emitted, although you can't physically connect to the servers potentially and log on to the server like you would have if you had built the environment. All of that information is going to be there. You just don't have access to the infrastructure services themselves, but all of that information is going to be emitted to you. Taking a look at identity, that's the left-hand side of this, is going to take a look at authentication within this AKS environment. And in another recording, we've talked about identities, and we've talked about user accounts and service principal names and security identities. We talked about managed identities as either all of those pieces now come into play. And the AKS solution, you'll see in the top right-hand corner there, it says you can't disable the AKS managed Entra ID integrations that are there by default. Second point, you can't, if you've built services back in the day when it was known as Azure Active Directory or ADDS, you might have to upgrade those service environments so that you can now take advantage of the new Entra IDs that are going to be available for you. So there's some ways for the authentication features that we've talked about in other recordings, using these monitored identities to actually manage the infrastructure that you're deploying to. I mentioned these different metrics that are being emitted. So there's the monitoring features that are available, but we also have the whole set of traditional log environments. Metrics and logs are features. Metrics are pure numbers. Logs are activities of specific features. You can get them either through the Azure portal or through some command line interface or PowerShell commands to get the metrics that are available for you to include in your measurements and assessments of your infrastructure. When you take a look at AKS, which we've just done, is a full end-to-end suite of containers. Now, that's the ability to have the pods, nodes, and pools. We have a feature, and we've talked about Azure App Services. Azure App Services, very similar, is not containers. It's that traditional environment of deploying either to, say, an IIS server on Windows or an Apache server running on Linux. We've also got something in between called an Azure Container Apps. This is a relatively new feature within the last year of this recording, where now instead of having app services running in app service plans in that traditional environment, maybe I'm not ready to go all the way to a full AKS solution with Kubernetes. I still want some containers, but I want to do all the orchestration, the management of it. So Azure Container Apps is kind of that Goldilocks piece right in the middle. And so we provide a whole set of benchmark security features that we have that can monitor and manage your Azure Container Apps that you might decide to deploy on your journey from traditional applications to an AKS solution. I mentioned that you might have a container registry. Going back to my whiteboarding session, that top right-hand corner, your container registry, you want to manage access to the registry. Who can actually publish images to the registry? Who can go in and change those images? Where can I pull those images out from and start to deploy? All of those are potential attack surfaces that you might want to consider monitoring for and controlling access to. And so that's what they're getting to here, is that container registry feature for the hosting of your containers that would then eventually run your applications once they're deployed. When we take a look at Azure Storage, and we'll be doing this in a bit more detail in another recording, but one of the things that both containers and AKS solutions have, they're referred to as non-durable. So they are an in-memory resident container that your application has. We mentioned in the drawing, you might have 4 cores. You might also have an amount of memory that's allocated to the container itself. So you got 4 cores, maybe you got 2 gigs of RAM, and so it's happily gathering some data, doing some calculations, it stores that information. The trouble is it's volatile. It may go away. And so to be able to make your information in a container durable, be lived beyond the existence of the container itself, you may need to write that information into some form of durable storage. And that's what they're talking about here. Azure Disk Encryption, as part of a feature for Azure Storage, you might want to be able to encrypt the storage that you're working with, as well as being able to, if you have virtual machines. So now your virtual machines have VHDs. Those VHDs need to be stored in some kind of storage. Those can be now stored into a storage account. And we have in the storage recording, we'll talk about things are stored at rest. So by default, at rest, all those storage information in a storage account are going to be encrypted at rest. But now if you have them on a disk, you can now have disk level encryption as well. So this is just talking about a layered approach from the storage itself to actually using disk level storage. And then you can get into even higher levels of encryption actually at the file level if you wanted to. It's not part of this course, but configure that disk encryption for your Azure disks if you wanted to use ADE for the host and confidential disk encryption. As I said, if you had a disk that you wanted to attach to some other virtual machine or to maybe a container itself. We didn't talk too much about this, but API management, there's a feature, APIM, that allows you to now host APIs inside of Azure and have a gateway service that people can come to access your APIs, whether it be internal or publicly facing. Now, access to the API endpoints, we would have covered those kind of topics in the networking features in that recording when we take a look at either private access to or public access to a resource. You might want to consider those of accessing the API endpoints. But even within API management, there is a set of security that we can work with and measure for as part of the Microsoft Cloud Security Baselines or benchmarks. There's a thing called an API front end and back end, and so we can have controls throughout the entire API management process, accepting information into it, processing at the back end, and what we allow back out. So there's another component that we can have configurations for the overall security. So there we've taken a look at a variety of IaaS, infrastructure as a service, that traditional virtual machine management, as well as a variety of PaaS, platform as a service, whether it be the app service plans, the Azure container applications, and the AKS solutions, and the API management, to name 4, as ways to have hosted compute resources inside of Azure and how we can manage them. So that's it for this recording. I look forward to seeing you at another recording.